and we'll record the Spanish and we'll record the English versions, and you will have access to that on the Biodynamic website as a conference participant once the conference is over and once we have processed all those files and edited them. So maybe in a couple weeks. If you have any problems using Zoom, then we found that turning your own video option off seems to help your computer run the program more smoothly. And just know that there's in the view option that you can see view for the speaker view and have a picture of Stuart hopefully talking, and then you can also pick the gallery view and see all of the beautiful faces of the 60 participants that are here. I will turn it over to Stuart now. Feel free to put any questions in the chat. You can also direct message to another participant if you see a friend and want to say hello, or if you want to just text me if you have a technical question. And Stuart can take questions of clarification throughout, so please feel free to use the chat for that interactive part. Stuart Lundy and his partner and wife, Natalie McGill, are the co-owners and farmers at Perennial Roots Farm on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. I have visited their farm a couple times. It is beautiful, it's magnificent, and their food is beautiful. And Stuart is a deep, beautiful thinker, well-read, and so smart talking about biodynamics. I'm so grateful to have him as a speaker today, and I'm grateful to be assigned to be the tech support for this workshop so that I can hear it too, and I'm glad that you're here with me. So let me introduce Stuart now.
All right, welcome everyone. As you've heard, my name is Stuart Lundy. I've been farming for the past decade in Accomack, Virginia at Perennial Roots Farm. We began as a diversified farm with a permaculture mentality. We always have had an organic mindset, but shifted very early into biodynamic practices in addition to these other regenerative efforts. This particular talk is going to engage the interplay between fire and air, in particular, bringing animals to the farm. This brings what is often termed in the biodynamic community as astrality, this animal energy to the farm that pushes it beyond where plants in and of themselves would actually develop. So for us, actually, this month, for the first time, cattle arrived to the farm. We got what is known as the Piney Woods breed of cattle, who have been in North America for 500 years. They have adapted very well, and their time here on the farm has shown what good instinctual wisdom and old heritage breeds can do. They're here eating all the different kinds of grasses, but in addition to that, we've noticed that they're eating pine needles. They're eating the leaves of other trees. They're even going and nibbling on bamboo. This is a breed of animal that has not forgotten its wisdom. It has not been forced in artificial situations to eat what we feed it. So these are wonderful animals who are already adapting to our farm. What's kind of fun in that story is we've been talking to these people for 7 years about getting this breed. And it turns out we ended up not getting them from the breeder I thought we were going to get them from, but instead we ended up getting them from someone in Mississippi. The spot in Mississippi is the exact same town where my grandmother was born, which was serendipitous. And then when the cows arrived to the farm, we discovered that the breed of sheep that we have, Gulf Coast native sheep, are also known as Piney Woods. And so we're actually reuniting old friends. They used to run them together. So all of it's felt very serendipitous. It's like it's meant to be. But there's something very special about bringing animals into play on the farm that is different than sticking to everything vegetable based. And we're going to get into that. So in traditional esoteric streams, whether it's biodynamic or other wisdom streams, there tends to be a threefold division of the human organism between the head, the hand, and the heart. So here you have the nervous system where you think, you have the circulatory system in addition to that, and then you have the metabolic system. Rudolf Steiner's term for this is the limb metabolic system. So your limbs together with your gut, which is all of your muscles. Your skeletal muscles move your arms and legs and even your jaw. Your jaw is a limb, but also your smooth muscles, which is how you digest things. And if these are taken into consideration as the fullness of the human organism, straying one way or the other leads to a one-sided approach to reality. If we're overly intellectual, that's a problem. We'll end up bulldozing the world and not being sensitive to its interrelationships. On the other hand, if we simply follow the lower organism, we'll end up in complacency, which is really not the goal of the human being. So the task of the farmer is to be that balancing middle. Some of you might have been in Dr. Claudia Ford's talk, and if you didn't get a chance to see it, I recommend going back and viewing the recording. But she referenced the poem where it was said that our love is our grief. This reminds me of the principle of equanimity that Goethe speaks of, where he says that the heart that loves is equally divided between joy and suffering for its entire life. And as a farmer, we have to balance those two. We can't stray towards pure sentimentality, where we can't cull the herd. And then we also can't be callous and detached from the animals. So we have to care, we actually have to care enough to be hurt every time we lose an animal, even though we must lose an animal. So these are the balancing influences. The heart serves that role within the human organism, balancing between the gut and between the brain, what we would now call the brain-gut axis. And you can see that depicted here. This is analogous to what we see in plants. The plant root has to do with the head system, the nervous system. Paul Stamets popularized the idea of the root as the neural network of the soil. Stephen Herod Buhner refers to neuronal roots, roots that are neuron-like. And if you take into consideration the fact that if you apply serotonin-based compounds to the roots of plants, they create new connections. Scientists have done some experiments applying Prozac to the roots of plants, which is a serotonin inhibitor. It also inhibits the roots in plants. Now, cow manure, which anyone who's getting into biodynamics at all knows is central to biodynamics. Cow manure is full of serotonin and other processes which stimulate good root hair development. At the center of the plant is the interface between the watery etheric body of the plant and the airy atmosphere. And then at the flower, you have these radiant processes where you have sulfur-based compounds, aromatics, which are designed to attract other insects and to just announce its presence to the world. If we continue this and flip it, the farm is like that plant, which is like an upside down human being. So today we're going to be dealing with that sulfur pole, that interface between warmth and air, which isn't really to be thought of as sulfur in the elemental periodic table. You can almost forget that. And in this particular case, we're speaking of alchemical sulfur, which is the process and interplay between things that can burn and warmth and light. A concrete example would be that of a wax candle is made out of these airy oils, which can be burned to generate warmth. The relationship of that to the metabolic system is that we enclose what we have chewed and we basically cook it. in order that it surrenders its aroma so that we can absorb the forces that we need from our food. So that is the relationship between the gut and the flower part of the plant. And this is actually the part that's probably most neglected within contemporary farming. So we have the limb metabolic system, which is both the skeletal and soft muscle. You have the rhythmic system, which is exemplified by the heart, centered in the heart, but clearly there's blood flow through your whole body. It's the entire circulatory system that regulates all of those rhythms. And then you have your nerve sense system. It is centered in the head, but you obviously have sensory nerves all across your body. So generally speaking, we can say that the sulfur polarity belongs to the flower part, the aromatic oils, and your metabolic system. Mercury in the middle, and salt below. Now, in conventional farming, we tend to focus on the salt polarity and the mercury, which is really water and soluble fertilizers, to the expense of the combustible materials like organic matter, compost, cover cropping. If all we did in approaching agriculture were to take all three of these principles together, we would be much closer to becoming biodynamic. And the preparations in particular are a way to help restore some of these forces which have been lost within the soil. So today we're going to focus on the gut of the farm. The gut of the farm is everything that you see above the soil. As counterintuitive as that might seem, but all of your animals grazing the field, eating what the plants have built, they're destroying things. They're chewing them, they're cooking them, they are breaking down the sugars, the light that the plant has breathed in, and it is a destructive metabolic process. And then they release their own emissions. Now, as long as this is balanced with the vitality of the farm, you're not contributing to climate change, but this is an aspect of the farm that needs to be brought back into play because we need those astral forces, that sulfur polarity, in order to improve that combustibility within the soil, in order to fuel good plants so that they produce really truly nourishing foods. This is a little video of the cow chewing her cud. Half of the reason that we focus on the cow as opposed to, say, the pig, is that they're so good at chewing their food. All the ruminants chew their food multiple times and then cook them again. You can think of every section of the rumen as almost a different season, and it goes through 4 seasons before it finally leaves the cow. But that repeated chewing of the cud pulverizes it, and then they cook it 4 different times before it emerges as manure. In that chewed state, it is far more easily assimilated and used by plants. It's not to say that there's actually more combustible material, it's just that it's been cooked. We cook food so that it's more easily assimilated, if that makes sense. And the manure is more easily digested by the plants who have no mouths. So they need physical matter to have been pulverized to such a state that it is as small and subtle as their own little pores. Plants themselves obviously can secrete certain acids to dissolve things in their environment, but the closer we get them to a plant-like state, the more easy it is for them to digest. For example, if you take a fresh bean, it's inedible in its raw state, basically. But if you cook the bean, the starches sweeten. And then if you make refried beans, they're very sweet. And this is the difference between raw plant material versus manure versus composted manure. The composted manure is like the refried bean of the plant world, so to speak. Now, I'm going to read this quote in full from Rudolf Steiner. He says, "In many parts of the world, nature herself cannot be relied on to enliven the earth with enough organic matter. Therefore, we must often assist plant growth with fertilization. This is least needed in the so-called black earth areas. In those areas, nature concerns itself with keeping the earth sufficiently alive. These are relatively rare spaces within the earth as a whole. You'll see them through the Midwest of the United States into Canada. There are patches like in Ukraine of what are self-regenerating soils. They have the right balance of water and air and just right that they build humus spontaneously every year. The rest of us are either going to have too little water for that vitality to continue, the more arid regions, which will tend towards an alkaline soil. And then you'll have the other areas which have too much rain and the soil becomes acidic, it gets leached out, the organic matter tends to burn off because the soil stays so alive. Um, Most of us are going to have to think about fertilization, and that is what this is about. It's about bringing those animal fruiting forces into the soil so that we have more nourishing foods. The activity of plowing itself is one where we turn under the living plant material and, in a way, emulate what the animals would do in chewing and digesting. This causes an explosion of vitality within the soil, and in Steiner's terms, lets light into the soil. And you can think of this literally in that sugars from the plants are now becoming available to the soil, but you can think of it in terms of light and air as increasing the surface area in the soil. And if we keep in mind that all life exists on thresholds, we're increasing the liminal space, the thresholds within the soil, which foster more microbiology, or if you want to think in terms of elemental beings, they exist always on these thresholds. Human civilizations, we live on the edge of land and water, or land and the forest, or we always between the earth and the sky. It's always on these thresholds that creatures live. In particular, I'm a strong advocate of deep ripping, whether you use a broad fork, a yeoman's plow, or some other subsoiler. The physical loosening, deep loosening of deadened soil allows air and light to reach down, allows water to get past any plow pan, and helps re-enliven that area. The light literally reaches the base. Okay, thank you. This photograph in particular is one from the late Alex Podolinsky, who helped advance biodynamics throughout Australia, helping consult with millions of acres. He did experiments on, I think it was several thousand acres for his farm. On the left, you have compacted sandy soil, where you can see almost nothing in terms of root development. And on the right, you can see a much more dramatic growth. The only difference between the two is 3 months' time. He used no compost, he used deep ripping, followed by cover cropping, and rotational grazing by ruminants. And I will read this quote because this is probably one of the most significant from the biodynamic community in terms of what we can do both to regenerate soil, but also addressing climate change, particularly on marginal land. In the early days, we ran trials. Depleted soil was deep ripped. We sowed the right species and applied 500 and had the well-known results. In 6 years, we raised the organic matter levels from 0.9% in the top 4 inches to approximately 12%, and varyingly to 2.4% at 40 inches depth. Ripping exactly the same way, etc., but without 500, the soil biology developed to 20 centimeters depth, but no further. In modern farming, the right soil treatment and the biodynamic preparations must be applied together. For me, biodynamics isn't something that is separate from good farming practices. It's something that builds onto good farming practices and augments it. Rudolf Steiner himself, when giving the agriculture course in 1924, he refused to speak about modern farming practices, if they worked or not. He didn't want to engage that. He said, continue fertilizing as you were with manures and compost and balancing your soil, but you add to it these processes that have been missing. There's a question in the chat asking, does ripping work the same way in tropical soil systems where there isn't a winter? I don't have direct experience with that myself. We're subtropical where we live on coastal Virginia, but we still do get a proper winter at different points. To what depth? As deep as you can. And depending on the horsepower of your tractor or your broad fork size, I would say 20 inches or more, if you can. What this does is help restore capillary action. If you've ever taken a piece of paper towel and just a dry paper towel and dip it into water, you'll notice that the water climbs up the paper towel until the whole paper towel is moistened. That is what we want to happen in the soil. But if you have a hard pan underneath, it's not able to do that. Instead, you're just living on this very shallow topsoil. So deep ripping has a similar benefit regardless of where you are. And there's where Alex Podolinsky was working too, there wasn't a proper winter either. There's a dormant season and then a wetter season, but his work I think is particularly relevant. So the 500 we'll actually get into in particular. That's going to be in the third set. But the 500 is the horn manure, and it has a radical significance in increasing earthworm populations, good root formation, and really helping enliven the earth. I rip about once a year. Initially, when we started ripping, I could only get it in about 8 inches. The next year, I could get it to about 16. And this year, I got it about 26 inches deep, which is a major improvement. You can do deep ripping in lines through the orchard. Yeah. Tilling is considerably different. You're then really fluffing up the earth and adding a lot of air in whatever layer you've tilled. The deep ripping just forms structural cracks, which allows cover crops to reach down and become anchored better in the soil. It's very different, and it's more of a sustainable process. So I want to talk about different kinds of manures for treating different kinds of soils. These are some diagrams I made based on some of Ehrenfried Pfeiffer's diagrams. You have chicken, sheep, horse, goat, cow, and pig. Each of these is qualitatively different. We have on the left the chicken, which is a very warm manure. This will really fire up the biology of the soil. And if you have, say, a cold soil, like a heavy clay or a peat soil, something that stays cold and heavy, chicken manure is something that is of particular use in that situation. If you extend that to sheep, it's also a warming influence, perhaps not as much as chicken, but you can see each animal has a mirror image in its manure of its own process. Horses are a warm manure in particular, and goat as well. These are all the warm manures. You get more cool manures on the right of this. Pig is pretty cold. The reason being they extract everything they can in order to store up their own warmth. The pig is quintessentially a hot animal. It can't sweat. It has to wallow in mud in order to cool off. And you just look at how much fat it accumulates. It takes all of those forces out of the food and it leaves no warmth. So there's not a lot of value in that sense in the pig manure. For biodynamics, the balance is considered the cow. While the cow manure is on the cooler side of things, the overall balance is to the benefit of a biodynamic farm, but ruminants in general, and then cow in particular. If you just look at the NPK values here, chicken manure is predominantly phosphorus, whereas sheep and horse and goat are predominantly nitrogen. Something changes though. If you have a lot of bedding mixed in with horse manure, it becomes predominantly potassium and carbon, and it even has a cooling effect because the carbon is basically sucking up all of that nitrogen. So you have to keep that in mind, that you may want to treat very differently something that's mixed with wood shavings or something that's yeah, just bedding from a barn. You just treat it a little. You may need to compost it longer. You may need to add something like sheep or goat manure in order to bring that to balance, if that makes it something warmer to counteract the cooling effect of having all that woody material in the manure. So as much as people talk about horse manure as being warm, in certain situations it can actually have a very cooling effect. You might just need to age it longer, that's all. So pig manure is predominantly potassium. Um, Incidentally, it's one of the meats that tends to have more phosphorus. So kind of the opposite of poultry manure in that sense. Again, goat is nitrogenous and cow is rather balanced, which is nice. So if you look here, this particular quote is from Valerius, the founder of agricultural chemistry, though he was strongly influenced by the alchemist Paracelsus. And I'll read this in full. Manuring, pinguifaction, is that operation by which land receives substances that nourish plants. Since neither earths nor salts supply homogeneous nutrients to plants, it follows that the benefit of manure consists in supplying land with a sufficient amount of fatness and humidity. That fatness element is precisely what we're focusing on in this sulfur element. This is alchemical sulfur. This is the fatness of the earth. These are the combustible materials. If you're distilling rosemary, for example, the oil that you get, that is alchemical sulfur. And that's what we're after. It's analogous to the relationship of a candle to the flame that it generates. You can see here a demonstration that I've done of adding salt to water. You can see a lot of the salt falls, and as long as it is moving, a lot of the salt can be held above its normal level where it would want to fall by gravity. You'll begin to see partway down these red flecks, which are actually bits of iron in this particular salt. And as I begin to add oil, you see that the clear differentiation between the salt and the oil itself. But if I stop the stirring, you'll see the natural tendency. The salt immediately falls to the bottom and the oil rises to the top. This is always happening within plants. The top of the plant is the hottest. If you were to look at it through an infrared lens, you can actually see that it is burning at that point. Some plants, this is specifically inhibited. For example, the flowering impulse in garlic, we pull off the scapes, we cut the flowers so that those sulfur oils go down to the root where the bulb swells up. If we don't cut the tips, we will not get a sufficient sizing in our garlic. When Steiner says that we need phosphorus and sulfur for good performing garlic, I don't think he specifically means elemental periodic table sulfur, but he means these combustible materials. You need well-aged manure. You need manure, really, is what he means for a well-performing garlic. The relationship of this sulfur element to warmth is that interplay between a wax candle and the light and warmth that it generates. You can see that right there. That activity that you're witnessing in the light generated by the candle is the sulfur activity. You can see here a quote from Paracelsus. That which burns is sulfur, That which evaporates is mercury, and that which remains in the ash is the salt. And this is how I'm going to be dividing these 3 talks. The first one we're going to be engaging with are the combustible materials, like organic matter, humus. The next one will be hydration, whether you need more water or less. And the third will be dealing with minerals, ash, and the biodynamic pest peppers. Now, there are many ways to deliver a medicinal remedy. And Rudolf Steiner talks about 3 particular approaches. One is through injection, which goes straight to the circulatory system. Another as a kind of bath, which enters the sensory nervous system. And one where you just ingest it, so it goes first to your metabolic system. If you are burning herbs and allowing the plants to breathe them in directly, you're affecting directly that middle section, which is the mercury that we're going to be talking about tomorrow. A lot of indigenous practices use burning herbs for when they harvest or when they plant, and there is an actual benefit to that that isn't simply up above and away on some spiritual level. It's also here, because spirit and matter are not separate. Another quote here from Steiner: "The root is rich in salts, the flower in light. People knew much more of this in the past. This is why they called the principle to be found in the flower phosphorus. But the flower is the true bearer of light. The flower itself is phosphorus." So for me, the fact that most of the biodynamic preparations are from flowers is that we're bringing this sulfur element, this phosphorescent quality of combustion back to the soil, since most traditional agriculture focused on manures and ways of manuring. That had begun to be ignored because they thought they'd figured it out with chemistry. Here is yarrow, which is just a masterful herb. It's one of the first of the biodynamic preparations for compost. This one is the master of all cardiovascular concerns. It's great for the kidneys. Steiner says it is very similar to the activity occurring between the kidneys and the bladder. This helps separate out coarser fluids from the more refined ones, which is to say the reproductive fluids from the salts that need to be removed, like urine. This is a wonderful herb. It's a styptic, so it stops bleeding externally. It's named Achillea millefolium, after Achilles, the warrior. It can stop serious external bleeding if you crush the blossoms and press it into the wound. But not only does it stop bleeding externally, it stops bleeding internally, and it also dissolves clots. So it has this almost miraculous quality of balancing the fluids within the human being. It's a truly remarkable herb. And there's something called the Pareto principle, which says that 80% of the results that you get come from about 20% of your work. That's about it. Here, within this set of biodynamic preparation herbs, May Bruce, which is M-A-Y-E, Bruce, found with her approach, which took the same herbs without using the animal sheaths, that she got about 80% of the results from 2 of the herbs, yarrow and stinging nettles. And I'm not saying to avoid making your own preparations or even buying them if you need to, but you should start now by putting these medicinal herbs in the compost pile. You really should. These are herbs that either we allow to grow wild, they do their thing, they die, they have their effect in the atmosphere, and then it's gone. How often do we really think to harvest these often high-value herbs and specifically put them in our compost pile? We really should do that as often as we're culling the herbs or causing them to restart the cut and come again process. We should bury those flowers quickly within the compost pile to save those oils, to save that sulfur element. By contrast, we have chamomile, which is, for what Steiner says, the harmful effects of fructification. And there's an old herbal text I found, I think it was from 1914, but they recommend boiling chamomile flowers together with tripe, which are cow intestines, and then using that decoction as a remedy against flatulence. For me, that's very similar to the image of making the preparation of stuffing chamomile into intestines. So these are not new ideas. They may be relatively new when they're applied to agriculture, but Steiner didn't simply make all of this up. He wove it together in a rather creative way, but again, he didn't simply come up with it out of nowhere. Yes, he did his own research. Yes, he looked at the growth formations of the plants and their inner meaning, but he also drew on peasant traditions, which is why he speaks so fondly of them. Now, stinging nettles, which is that real power horse of a plant, it belongs in the middle. Steiner says it grows or should grow around the human heart. It has all essential amino acids, and there's almost this descent of the flowering process into the leaf. You could say this plant is all flower because its visible flowering process is hidden. It's descended, and the entire thing is full of trichomes, these raying points, which will burn you if you touch them. But that whole process of raying heat and light has descended into the entirety of the plant. So you can see how this could relate to that air element and the fluid element of the heart, and how special this plant really is. The flowers themselves, you can barely see them. Take a microscope and look at it, but they almost have no visible flower. Instead, the entire plant is like a flower. Every aspect of it has this raying light process. If you were to look at this through an infrared lens, you'd see every single one of the little trichomes, these spines, as almost like beams of light, beacons shining out through the entire plant. So this is a plant that is almost all flower. As counterintuitive as that may seem, but the entire flowering process is happening within the leaf, which is why if you touch it, it stings you. That's all through it. You could almost say that, it's just a remarkable plant. Steiner says it belongs growing around the human heart. Traditionally, this is used as a blood builder, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful herb. There are other Urtica species that can be used as a blood building tonic. And, this is just the one that Steiner said would probably be hardest to find a substitute for. Now, there are Urtica varieties that grow everywhere that would probably serve as a substitute if this one simply refused to grow. But this plant in particular is the one that consistently improves flavor in plants. Like that's truly amazing. Yes, actually, there's a slide I get to later. This is stinging nettles. Stinging nettles. Urtica. Now, Alan Chadwick refers to building a compost pile out of nothing but stinging nettles, a big one. So it generated its own heat, and he said in 3 days he had finished humus. 3 days, not 3 months or 3 weeks, 3 days. Now, if anybody has ever taken fresh cut stinging nettles and put them outside in a really hot summer day, they blacken the same day. So you can see they have this tendency towards mineralization if you put them out in the sun. But if you have them covered with their other plant material, it can't ever quite turn to dust. It instead turns to that step right before mineralizing, which is good colloidal humus. Good colloidal humus. And I'm going to show the process of making this preparation in particular so that you can see how you can make this now, even if you don't have animal sheaths, because this is the one Steiner says does not need an animal sheath. So you take the herbs, let them wilt a little bit, not a lot, just so they lose a bit of that watery mass, and then you stuff them into a clay vessel. This clay vessel is then buried for a full year in something surrounded by peat moss or whatever, just to insulate it from the surrounding environment and perhaps to keep earthworms from showing up and gobbling it up, because it's really tasty stuff for them. Why do I say the clay flue tile or the clay amphora? It's that This is not an animal sheath, but it does prevent that communication with the outside soil. I found that if I bury nettles without a sheath and surround them with peat moss, things gobble them all up. Um, Someone's asking whether stinging nettles would improve most secondary metabolites in plants. The answer is absolutely yes. Stinging nettles has all essential amino acids plus several additional ones. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that develops. Terpene development, absolutely. I see Colorado. I know what you're talking about. Yes, it is a trichome covered plant. It has all these amino acids. And in addition to that, if you grow stinging nettles near aromatic oil herbs like rosemary, you can double and triple the amount of oil content just by it commingling with the roots. This does not replace any animal part. For the stinging nettle preparation, traditionally there's no sheath at all. You just put it in the earth. I find I lose too much of it when I do that. I just put it in the clay so that it is in an earthen vessel, not an animal vessel, and that just makes it safe for me to leave to age. But yeah, stinging nettles has, oh boy, calcium, magnesium, iron, just it has silica. Like it's an amazing plant. It really is this kind of all-purpose herb. I think the herbalist Matthew Wood says, when in doubt, use stinging nettles. Like just if you don't know what's wrong, try stinging nettles. Like that's for the human being, but I think it applies through the farm. So the next one is oak bark. This is something that should be added to the compost pile, ideally in the preparation form. There's a reason I'm not getting into all the preparations is I know that there's another introductory biodynamic course, and I just can't hope to cover everything I want to if I get into all of that. So you have to forgive me if I can't go into as much detail as I'd prefer. Now, oak bark in particular helps kill off excessive vitality. The tannins in it, combined with the calcium, have this kind of drying, astringent quality on the excessive ethericity within a compost pile or for plants. This helps dry it up so that the astrality can enter in properly, and you can end up with the proper development of a compost pile into more of a nitrogenous animal direction, if that makes sense. Steiner recommends oak bark and Salix species willow for asthma in his medical lectures. And he recommends both. He says you can use either. He says both have this activity of pressing down the etheric body so that it's not too active and then allows more free breathing. This is true of either. And a lot of people make a big deal that Steiner says oak bark is about 77% calcium by its mineral ash content if you burned it. But most good hard barks are more than 50, even 60% calcium by ash content. So that's almost more of a bark quality than it is unique to oak bark. Now, 50% more calcium, that's still a lot more calcium. So I don't mean to dismiss it at all. Steiner recommends Quercus red oak, I believe it was. But in North America, we use white oak. And Aaron Fried Pfeiffer found that white swamp oak in Maryland, grown on sandy soil with very low calcium, had more calcium in the bark than any oak that he'd ever found in Europe. So he considered it to be a worthwhile substitute. If you look at some of Bockamule's work, you'll find he recommends certain possible other alternatives. So if I were to look for an alternative, I would seek one that was traditionally used for tanning leather. The tannin content has a high calcium property, used traditionally in indigenous medicine for asthmatic breathing conditions. And I would triple check by looking at scientific literature on that herb to see if it has similar properties. If you triangulate those, you'll be able to find something similar. I would consider if you don't have a lot of oak bark near you, grind up and use willow bark. Like I'm not saying it will have exactly the same effect, but you should be providing these medicinal possibilities to your compost pile, if that makes sense. Yeah, if you don't have one variety of oak, use the one that's there. And in some ways, I really think that the plants growing where you are more suitable for where you are than any medicine brought in from somewhere else. So it's about finding in spirit the same activity that's happening locally, that's happening indigenously, rather than having to import European herb. Now, uh, the nice thing about most of these is they grow on basically every continent. There are some areas that they refuse to, but that might mean that that particular may not be the part that's needed. You may actually need an opposite influence. Like if dandelion, for example, refuses to grow, there may be another herb that will fill that niche. How would you harvest oak bark? You can just take a paint scraper um, or a piece of metal and just scrape the very outside, the part that's spontaneously flaking off. You do not have to cut into the cambium or anything green. You're just taking the outside. So you're not hurting the tree. It's for the tree, it would be like, it's like exfoliating the skin. So it doesn't hurt it at all. Don't go too deep, but you don't need a lot. And if you're doing that, I would pulverize it in a blender or a mortar and pestle, and then spread that through your layers of compost pile in particular. Alan Chadwick recommends if you that building a compost pile under an oak tree is a really good place because it has that radiant effect of the entire activity of the oak tree constantly, I don't know, oakifying the compost pile, even without adding anything. And Aaron Fried Pfeiffer indicated about the oak that of all the trees, it is one of the only one that thrives in monoculture, but one that encourages polyculture. That you can plant a huge monoculture of nothing but oaks and it will be very happy because they produce such a balanced, generous, welcoming soil. If you look under a pine tree, you'll find very few species germinate. If you look under an oak tree, you will find dozens of species arising. So oak leaf makes one of the most beautiful balanced soils. Yes. Tannin, the word etymologically comes from the word that means oak. So there's this deep kinship there. So dandelion, traditionally, both for the yellow property that's associated with liver conditions. So if someone has jaundice, they'll get a yellow color. So at least traditionally, using the doctrine of signatures, people would look at the yellow and say, oh, this is related to the liver. Now, dandelion is actually related to the liver and not just because of the color. It has this, it's a quintessential liver tonic herb, and this is one that we should be using in our compost pile. I don't have enough time to get into the weeds about that one, but this is one that should also be used. And if you have similar ones, oak leaves would be a great compost ingredient. Absolutely wonderful. You should chop them up as much as you can so they don't smother layers in the compost pile, because leaves tend to compress and that can cause parts of the compost pile to go anaerobic where they can't breathe. So yeah, but they're wonderful if you can mix them in. Then there's valerian. This is the one in particular that is almost a quintessentially sulfur one. All of these flower aspects have to do with the sulfur polarity. But in this one, Steiner's handwritten notes, he writes valerian essential oil. He says to press the flowers to get their juices, and you use this in order to activate the phosphorus processes. Now, I do not think he means phosphorus as in NPK. I feel he really means this entire phosphorus process of the flower polarity, the fruit polarity, and the activation of this within the soil. So I think it was and one of the biodynamic conferences, Corey Eichmann talked about valerian and that we perhaps should be using it when we spread manure in order to that it is used well within the soil. Yeah, valeriana. And I tend to think that he very well may be right. Now, valerian, I think Steiner chose this in part because of its traditional etymology as coming from uh, uh, Balder. The word for it was Baldrian, Baldrian, from Balder, the god of light. And this was traditionally used for a remedy against hysteria, where, at least in Steiner's mind, the etheric body has overreached where it should be. And this helps it work correctly. Like there's this idea of that balancing, and that's part of the context that I think lends to that. There's almost too much of a lunar activity, and it needs to be muted by the light. And I think that's a big issue with this. So again, I'm not trying to encourage anyone to not make the preparations or to not try to acquire them, but do what you can now and then improve the next time you build your compost pile. Improve every time, actually, but start with what you have and at least bring these flowers, bring these forces into your compost pile. So when you add the preparations, in particular, once they've the transformed version of these herbs, and you put them into different corners of your compost pile, you end up with this radiant effect where they go from one quarter to the other until they then balance each other. And it's really a beautiful process. Steiner uses the term radiation, but if you have a compost pile that you don't keep moistened enough, the whole compost process stops. So you have to have it living. It needs to be moistened, just like a plant or an animal. It needs enough water. So when building a compost pile, whatever layers you do, I recommend watering in every layer as much as you can as you go, because it needs that. Even if it seems moist already, it's a good idea to have a hose or water in everything as you're building it. So here's a quote again from Rudolf Steiner. You must make the compost pile smell as little as possible, which you can achieve easily by first laying thin layers of waste material, then something like peat moss on top of that, a kind of a biofilter you can imagine, and another layer of compost materials, etc. Adding these absorptive layers of carbonaceous materials holds the scent together, which otherwise would be lost because nitrogen very much wants to return to the atmosphere and form all sorts of possible connections. Because of nitrogen's strong affinity for the carbon framework, astrality is thus retained. This is another reason for using oak bark through your compost pile as the possible substitute for something like maybe an unsustainable product like peat. If you don't use peat, you could use something like coconut coir, but the bark potential is already there. And if you already have the oaks or you have the willows, that's something I would personally encourage you to use. This idea of scent, though, it is integral to this idea of anything as a living organism. Everything alive has an inside and an outside, and then a skin to separate those two worlds that filters scent. If you consider the difference between petting a live sheep versus how its manure smells, which is what its insides smell like, it's very different. Or even the difference between either of those and the scent of like meat, raw meat from a sheep. There's a very different scent, and those scents should be retained within the organism. You shouldn't allow those to escape. That's really half of what we're after in agriculture, is that these plants have such small mouths, the pores on their roots and on their stomata, they almost live off scent more than they live off of substance, if that makes sense. Things have to be so subtle, so refined that the plant can then use them, that if we were to just to pile leaves around the roots of a plant, yeah, it'll be a trickle feed, but it's not going to feed the biology of the soil or provide the forces that the plant needs, because it takes sometimes years for like oak leaves to decompose if they're not put under the right conditions. So here's an example of building a compost pile. The first step is to dig out a bowl within the earth, separate that topsoil. You're going to use that. Then you add your layers. I like to do all these layers. So you do hot layer, cold layer, or you can think green, brown, whichever floats your boat. And then I like to do an earthen layer, always covering the outside with earth. So hot, cold, and then earth. The entire thing is coated. Sometimes you won't have enough topsoil left over. So even if you have an old rug or some sort of compost fleece, it provides the compost pile with a skin. If you don't put a fleece on your compost pile, it will develop its own brittle mineralized skin. Never quite to bark, but it will develop its own. And so if you want more of your compost to be more alive and more valuable, an artificial skin will serve you very well. And it will also help trap odors and scents that otherwise would have tried to escape. So we're on a transition point. We then can talk about the water and how it relates here. We've been talking about all of these combustive properties and bringing those to the soil, but then we need to talk about, well, how does water relate to air and evaporation? In different areas, you're going to have to deal with water in opposite ways. If you're in a tropical area and it's in the rainy season, you're going to want to build your compost pile with more of a peak, because you want water to shed quickly. So you're building it really in the shape of fire. If you're in a more temperate area and you want water, let's say you're building it in the summer, you may build a groove in the center so that it receives moisture and it helps keep things hydrated. This is the shape that's the most balanced that Aaron Fried Pfeiffer preferred. And this is, you're looking at it from the side. So this is lengthwise if you extend it outwards. Yeah, you really could have multiple compost piles and even different compost piles out of specific things like comfrey to develop into the best food for nightshades, for example, or something like stinging nettles, which is a favorite of everything. A rounded one has, again, a more temperate effect, and I like the look of that. Victor Schauberger recommended something halfway between the triangle and the sphere shape, which is an egg shape, which I like that. The detriment of building a compost pile directly on top of concrete is that it does not have capillary action. All it can do is dry out. And you want the compost pile to have a connection with the earth, but also with the water within the earth. That is how the capillary action can occur. When you, again, put that paper towel into the water and it wicks up, that helps the compost pile stay alive. And if it has no connection to the earth, it will dry out all the more. And then the life processes come to a stop. So you need it to have, ideally, some connection to the earth. If you don't, and for some reason just practically can't do it, you will probably have to monitor the water levels of that a lot more than you would if it were sitting out on soil. Now, if we extend this, you can see the possible flow of water over these. You can start a compost pile any time of year. And you can build it incrementally. And as long as you keep covering the top layer with soil, and then that with an old rug or something, if you have vermin showing up, if you have flies and maggots showing up, they can smell the scent escaping. You're already losing those forces. So the covering with the earth and covering with some sort of artificial skin really helps retain the odor, because you want the odor, because the smelling of all of that's basically what the plants need to live and to really, really provide. The stinging nettle preparation you can put somewhere else, but once it's finished, you would insert into kind of the center of the compost pile. And It is the only preparation herb that Steiner says to gather as much as you can. All of the others, Steiner says, you only need a little, you only need a little. So stinging nettles kind of gets an extra priority because of that. The artificial skin could be plastic, probably not ideal, but you know, it's you do what you can and you improve next time. Yeah, raw canvas. That's a very good suggestion. Semi-breathable, so some water can go in, some things can go out. It doesn't fully suffocate it, but you do what you can, and yeah, sawdust can work as well. Um, Thoughts on composting animal matter? I assume meat and things like that. If you do that, it's a good idea to add things like that are really absorptive, like the oak bark all around it, to try to dry it up, because otherwise it'll have a tendency to putrefy and become nasty. How big of a pile? You really want a pile that's about 9 cubic feet at least. um, at least. And you can use earth, wood chips, these shavings, but if you have something you can pull over it, you can really control that process, and you'll find that you're getting better compost than you'd have ever imagined, because the water levels are stabilized within the pile. And it becomes almost more like a preparation because it has that almost magical sheath to it. So I'm going to make an exception here. Most places are going to build up your compost pile, but if you're in a desert or an arid region where you don't get enough water, if you water your compost pile and you build it up, it's just going to dry out very easily, particularly if you don't have a good sheath over it. You may actually want to put it under the ground so you can build a compost pit. And this is one that will receive water more readily. Now, someone who's in a really rainy area, this will sound like lunacy, but this is something that would really benefit people who are looking to deal with this evaporation condensation problem, and they need to keep the water. Well, if it has earth on all sides, you're going to keep a lot more of that water. And you can even build it in such a way that it only has earth on 3 sides. So you can, and one side you have, I don't know, wood paneling, so you can remove those like a pallet. And then you can just come in with a bucket loader or back up your truck to it and take it away. Wood ash would be something that would be something good to add, but you don't want to add too much at any given time. It has such a strong effect. It's a good effect if you need it, but it needs to be balanced with the rest of the compost pile. Wood ash kind of belongs to our third session, which is going to be on Sunday. So we can talk a little more about wood ash then. So I'm going to wrap this up with a single idea. Again, we're back to this plant and human being image. We've been talking about these combustible materials and building this ideal compost in order to fuel more of the fruiting forces in a plant. What we're going to be talking about next isn't just the interface of how these oily combustive things help fuel the fire of the soil and build to this receptivity to cosmic forces, but we're going to talk about the relationship of water and air. The main evaporative force isn't fire. Like if you cut fresh herbs, you don't just put them in the oven and expect that to work. No, you want a breeze. You put them by a fan. The movement of air is really the fastest way to that a field dries out, and also the fastest way to dry your herbs. So that is the relationship of mercury. Mercury is that the dynamic interplay between the water element and the air element. When you have dew condensing or evaporating, when you have rain falling, that all belongs to this central system. And we as farmers need to moderate this, which is what I've been talking about with that compost pile of the sheath. That becomes a participation in that mercury center, the rhythmic elements. And like the heart pauses the blood flow and says, oh, let's hold back there. If you were to look at the heart and imagine how many miles and miles and miles of of capillaries it has to push blood through, it would be impossible given the amount of very low pressure that comes from the heart. You actually would need a massive pump to push the blood out to your periphery through all of these veins and arteries. It would be impossible. What's actually happening there is there's a kind of suction that the heart really stops a flow that was already occurring within the human organism. And we as farmers want to say, oh, let's hold this back right here because I need to retain this, and then let it go. And that's what we do with the compost pile. That's what we do when we're managing water on the farm. That if you were to look at the early development of embryology, you'll notice that the embryo develops an independent pulse before it has a heart. And that's similar to everything else that we're dealing with. There is a natural rhythm, and your farm kind of piggybacks on that, and then you choose to slow this part down to speed that part up. And we serve as farmers as that kind of regulatory heart, which is in many ways more of a sensing process than it is a pump at all. There are more nerves sending signals to the brain from the heart than there are sending signals to the heart. And it's sensing, albeit on a subconscious level, but it's sensing the processes at work with the blood. Someone's asking about ripping in an established orchard. That is harder. If you've started it earlier in an orchard, you can do it very deep and repeatedly because the roots adapt to that. But yeah, you're going to either need to broad fork around kind of almost the drip line of the trees if you really want to improve that, or you can go down the main lanes between your trees. And that distance, if it's 10 feet or more away from the tree, you should be okay. It's something to experiment with, and I would only try one lane, see how the trees behave, and then move forward from that. Yes. So with your deep ripping, do you use a conventional tractor implement or one specially made? We use the yeoman's plow. It's a pasture plow, which it requires relatively low horsepower in order for each shank, but that is one of the more significant things. I'm a big fan of cover crops. I really am. But I've noticed that if you have a bad plow pan like we had when we were here, and this is sandy soil, that something like a tillage radish, it will grow down and then make a hard 90-degree turn. I've ended up with L-shaped tillage radishes growing because the soil was that compacted underneath. And this is where mechanical loosening opens up these channels, and then they can grow through the channels and then expand, cracking the soil open more. And then you start to soften the soil and it becomes more alive and alive deeper, if that makes sense. But yeah, we use that implement. That's a bigger one and a more expensive one that is necessarily absolutely needed. You can use, just look up deep rippers, a subsoiler. A good subsoiler doesn't have to be really expensive. Alan Chadwick talks about how if you just set pulleys up correctly, you wouldn't even need a tractor to move an implement like that. He talks about having done that himself. He just rigged up pulleys and was able to pull with a few people and implement across his entire garden to do the deep ripping, which is pretty incredible. I broad fork almost every year. Yep. And now that we've done that pretty regularly, I've started shifting over to using the tractor implement one, and I'll straddle one of the beds and I'll take that down, and I'm doing it different directions, different times. And I really only do that about once a year. Yeah, we got it all done a lot faster this year because the soil conditions were better. And then we got a lot of nice rain. So the yeoman's plow is better than the other ones because its shanks are so narrow. You only end up with a gap about this big in the soil. when it's working correctly. And then with a little bit of rain, our soil just goes, and you can have cattle on it the same day. So that's why I'm a big fan of that. Some subsoilers just are a bit more violent and turn up the soil more. So that's why I'm a fan of that. But that helps both with the air and light getting into the soil, but also helps um, this whole process of deepening the roots and breathing. And you're going to notice that nothing is purely sulfur, nothing is purely mercury, except in rare cases where you're dealing with something like ash, literally ash, or essential oils. There's always an interplay of how all of these elements to work together, but we're always seeking to balance them. So it's rare you're going to end up with pure distilled water. Even rainwater is bringing in more than just distilled water. It's bringing in all sorts of trace elements through the atmosphere. So it's always a give and take. It's always, very fluid. So what is demanded of the farmer is always going to be different, because every season is different and every farm is different. Someone's asking about heavy metals in urban areas. Yeah. Um, at the last biodynamic conference, I believe it was Leah Penniman who talked about using marigolds as a remedial measure, and those accumulate lead, so you can take those and then get rid of them. You can use, I believe sunflowers do something similar. I would consider that in terms of remediation. Another hyper accumulator of lead is comfrey, so be careful. You really shouldn't be eating comfrey as a food. It's a great composting material, but the amount of lead it accumulates, and then some of these liver toxins it also has, there's some reasons to be cautious about that. Cannabis as well. 30-inch bed, single rip. Yeah, and you might offset it 1 year to the left, 1 year to the right, 1 year in the middle, and then just keep straddling that. There's a question. I would like to know if the ceramic containers can replace any animal parts for the preparations. When it's a small place and there's no cow, can this option work? Yeah. It does not replace the cow function. If you were looking to make one of the other preparations that requires the animal membrane, you'll either need to develop a relationship with someone who is a biodynamic farmer or someone at a slaughterhouse where you can source grass-fed animal parts. Again, if you're not able to source the animal parts, it's not absolutely the end of the world, but that's where I emphasize using the herbs, because that is something that almost everyone can access. You can try as an experiment developing and preparing things within nothing but clay ideally round bottomed sheaths like an amphora, and see what happens. But you would need to do trials side by side to really see if you'd attained the same effect. You might get very close, but in particular when it comes to the horn manure and horn silica, you're going to be missing something if there's not that animal element. That really brings something, and I'll get more into that. Yeah. If you're building a compost pile with a load of cow manure, how do you need to layer it? It would be good if you could. It would be good to layer it. Cow manure can pretty spontaneously turn into beautiful humus, depending on how big it is. But having some layer of soil in it has a twofold effect. On the one hand, it's a biofilter and helps retain the scent, the aroma of the manures. And then in addition to that, you're cooking the soil. So the soil then releases something from the parent material. Yes, someone says here that, and I have said this in an earlier seminar, that if you can't have animals to use earthworms, that you're still a shepherd, even if it's just of the invisible realm. So having an earthworm bin and developing that that might be your main livestock. But Steiner says that earthworms leave behind the perfect ethericity for plant growth. So that sounds pretty good. Now, that's for plant growth. I will say that that's not the same as the ripening, fructifying forces that we're emphasizing in this. That will bring enough for the plant to grow and be healthy. But if you want nice, big, lush tomatoes, you're going to need more but earthworm castings are technically, they are a kind of animal manure. Someone's asking about deer bladder. Can other species of deer be used? Yeah, we don't use the same species that they use in Europe. And in Australia, where they're lacking ruminants, they use kangaroo bladders. So the indications there are, again, you're looking for a nervous animal with big nervous eyes, whiskers. They often have an aspect of them that's continually growing. And you seek that out. Like a sheep or a goat on the farm is much closer to the deer than, say, the pig. I'm not saying you should use a sheep or a goat, but you should see it as a spectrum. And yeah, the deer may be ideal, but you also approach as close as you can to that. Yeah, in terms of scale, yeah. Steiner talks about the preparations in terms of how much you need. Again, you need very little for treating compost. So that's pretty standard. Now, we buried about 500 horns this year, and we're a 40-acre farm. I'm not doing that because I need that much, but I like to make sure that the farm is creating more than it needs for its own fertility and enough to send to other people. So that's just part of my particular disposition towards it. But in terms of scale, yeah, Steiner recommends, some people say about a horn per an acre. Those Steiner's original indications were, I think, for 1,200 square feet, one horn was enough. But as you are stirring more and more water, it's the law of diminishing returns. Having any in the stirred water is way more than none. And you don't need a lot to have this really powerful stimulating effect. The particular preparation that Alex Podolinsky used was 500, and then he would empty it from the horns, and then he added all of the finished compost preparations, and then that digests. So you're ending up with the 500 manure preparation and all the rest of these. Maple leaves would have a different effect. It would bring astrality, but maybe not the same effect. Like there's a very different process happening in maple. You can still use the leaves. No harm necessarily there, but it doesn't have the same benevolent effect. So yeah, we're nearing the end here. And if there's a final question, I don't want to get cut off because I know people need to go to have their break, and then there'll be the keynote. So.
Stuart, this is magnificent. I feel like we went through a whirlwind of information and still took it in a really thoughtful and beautiful way. I just love your illustrations and the variety of photos. And I love that we're going to get to spend 2 more days with you. I'll save the chat, and if there are questions that we didn't get to, I'll email them to you, and then we can use some time maybe in the next 2 sessions to answer anything, or if you want me to send out anything to all the people registered for the workshops. And then I did want to remind everyone that the next keynote starts in 30 minutes with Winona LaDuke, and I think she's an amazing person, and I hope that I just feel really excited to hear her speak and hear her thoughts on everything.
Just one quick thing I'd like to add. If anyone hasn't seen my 8 microdynamics webinars that I presented this year, those deal concretely. Some people are asking some questions about starting the biodynamic process. And this first steps for starting a garden, that's specifically what I go through in the Microdynamics webinar series. The 8 recordings are available for free through the Biodynamic website, and that grapples with this. What I'm trying to display for these 3 is a lens through which to see things and to manage and balance these 3 elements. But the brass tacks of that are, I mean, they're full of information, almost none of which I've covered in this today. So yes.
Thank you everyone for being here. It's just really heartening to see everyone and see everyone's eyes and attention and connecting to this information. It's beautiful to see it from here in the Appalachian Mountains and see people from all over. So I hope I get to see you in the next session in 30 minutes. And I will certainly see you tomorrow. And thank you, Stuart. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience with us.
Thanks everybody for coming out.
Yeah, you feel free to unmute yourselves and say goodbye and say thank you to Stuart. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Stuart.
Thank you, Stuart.
Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.